meeting you right where you are on your foster care journey. This is the Forgotten Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Forgotten Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Cabe, and I am so happy to be with you. If you are part of the foster care community, passionate about serving, or simply interested in learning more, we are here for you. In every episode of this podcast, you will hear stories from men and women who have experienced foster care to one degree or another. They may have grown up in the system, are caseworkers, foster parents, or others who are here to bring you hope or encouragement. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe and share it with a friend. And remember, you are not alone. I hope you enjoy the Forgotten Podcast. Well, today on the podcast, I have two of my very favorite people with me. In fact, I wore my blazer for this very special episode. Jonah and Sarah Wilson, thanks for coming on today. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thanks for having us. We're excited.
Sarah actually works with me at the Forgotten Initiative, and Jonah is her husband, so he is also part of the TFI family, just because. Right, Jonah?
That's right.
So we're really excited to hear your story. Before you became part of the TFI family, you were foster parents, and that's really what we're going to highlight today and talk about your journey. And that's where we're going to start. So I just want to ask you first, like when you guys were first maybe dating or even getting married, were you having conversations about being foster parents? What was that? What did that look like for you two?
Well, for me, I didn't have any awareness or knowledge about foster care until Sarah and I started dating. I don't think I even knew what it was, but shortly after we began dating, I learned what it was because Sarah grew up with foster siblings. And so that was something we talked about early on. And when we later got married, it was something that we were continuing to be interested in. And it was something that I think I viewed as a way that we could help care for children. My kind of purview at that point was certainly focused on children rather than families as a whole, but that was kind of the initial place where we started.
Okay. Yeah. And Sarah, when did your family start fostering? When do you remember first understanding this whole world of foster care?
Yeah, I would imagine sometime around the age of 8 to 10. I was pretty young when that began. And so I don't remember much about what led up to that point other than, just after things had begun. And as I grew into adulthood, I can't think of a clear moment where I was like, yes, I want to be a foster parent. It was just always something that I had in the back of my mind due to the experiences that I had. But I do remember early on when Jonah and I were married. Obviously, it's something that we had talked about from the time that we were dating, but I was able to listen to someone give a presentation at the church we were attending at the time, and it just struck my heart. And I think in many ways propelled me into action. We weren't in the season of life then where we were able to do something immediately. We were still students at that point. But really from that point on, it was just kind of us waiting until we were at a place where we could confidently step into caring for someone else. So that is the moment that really stands out in my mind.
Okay. So would you say, Sarah, that awareness led you to action?
It did. Yes.
Amazing.
Funny how that works.
No, that's awesome. So then, okay, so I love to hear that first part of the differences where you kind of came from. So when did you start to get serious about the two of you actually pursuing foster care?
Yeah. So when I first heard that presentation, Jonah was still a student in college. And so we were living in a 1-bedroom apartment that was barely big enough for the two of us. And so for us, we were just waiting until we had kind of moved out of that student phase. We were in living somewhere that was suitable to host guests and kind of had stable income, some of the basic things. And so it was actually just about a month after Jonah graduated college that we moved into our first house, and we started the paperwork immediately. And as you know, that takes some time, but we had our first meeting that June, and it was 6 or so months later that things really started picking up.
Wow. Who was the biggest driver of this?
Would you say it was you? I mean, I don't feel like it was you. I would say you.
You were just kind of on the same page.
I would say generally, if there was one, probably you, Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I was the one that was reaching out to different agencies and setting up times to meet with them. But certainly something that we waited until we were both ready to do. One thing that was really important to both of us was that we pursue foster care before we consider having a biological family. And so I think that was something that propelled us to move quicker as well and to start having those conversations, because we knew that that was our hope someday to pursue that, whether that would work out or not. And so in many ways, we were ready to get that portion of our life started.
So tell us more about that decision to pursue foster care before considering trying for biological children.
Jonah, I'll let you start off there.
That's okay. You start. You brought it up. So you start.
So I think for many things in life, you add something new to your plate, and other things that maybe you have a heart for or a desire for sometimes have to take the back burner. And I think the same came to mind when we thought about pursuing a family, in that if we were to get pregnant and have a baby, then we were really going to be delaying that process of becoming foster parents for quite a few years while we settled into that new rhythm of being a family. And so that's not to say you can't do both, but in our minds, we were under the impression that if we made that decision, then we were going to push that off. And so we were ready to step in and do that beforehand, and excited to see how the Lord was going to use it. Jonah, you were kind of the driving force behind that decision.
Was I? I agree with what you said. I think it was well put. I don't think I have anything else to add there.
Fair enough.
That's awesome. I think that's really interesting. And that's not something you hear of very often, but I think it's really goes to priorities. And like you said, like, we believe that we're supposed to do this. This is something we're called to. And so let's do this first. And obviously we know now, and we can talk more about who came into your home, but we know that God had a very specific plan for you. And clearly he put that in your heart. So let's talk about when you received a call for a baby boy.
Yeah, that was a surreal day. It's so funny because as you go through the process, at least with our agency, they told us over and over again, you won't get a newborn baby. So we had this age range that we were willing to accept, and we were trying to prepare to have things on hand for whenever that time came. And they just kept saying, you're not going to have a newborn baby, so you don't need to be prepared in that way. And so when I answered the phone call that morning, and it was very stereotypical foster care call, we don't have a lot of information. We're looking to place this child today, and it's a newborn baby boy. I was shocked, more than just getting the phone call finally for the first time, but also because it was a newborn baby boy. And so I think that in my mind, I had already said yes, but I told the worker on the phone, hey, I'm going to call my husband and see what he says, and I'll give you a call back in a few minutes. And so I gave Jonah a call, and Jonah, you can share your perspective.
Yep. So it was a Friday, and typically I don't do much work on Fridays, but I happened to be in doing a little bit of work and finishing up a few things for that weekend. And it wasn't much of a discussion necessarily, because it was what we were ready for a call at some point, and we didn't know what that would look like, but there was certainly no reason why not. And so we said yes. And I came home, and I remember we ate some lunch and tried to eat some food quickly. And then we headed down to where we were going to be. We had a little bit of a drive to get to the place where we would be picking him up. And they asked us to come and meet them at our local Walmart and pick up some things. So we had some supplies, but kind of like Sarah said, we didn't have a ton of supplies for newborn babies. And so we went, and they provided some supplies for us, which was very nice. Our agency did that for us. And then afterward, we went over to the hospital. So that was all in the span of about, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours probably.
So
from call to pick up, just about 4 hours.
It's just crazy. And I know this, and for me, in our experience with foster care, we actually had days, which is not normal. Well, it's not what's normal in foster care.
Yeah.
But our kids were at a different placement before they came to us. And so there was a little bit more time.
Yeah.
And it's just hitting me in a new way today, listening to this, of like, 3 hours, people, like 3 hours, and you have a newborn. It's crazy. I mean, you guys what were you feeling in this moment?
I think there are a few key things that stand out about that day. The first being that as soon as I got off of that phone call, and certainly this is not the experience of every foster parent, so I don't want to portray it like it is. But just hearing about this baby that was waiting, I immediately loved him. And I immediately felt this connection. And you know how foster care goes. We don't even know if we're going to be able to pick him up.
Right.
But I loved him. And I was looking with anticipation at what the next days were going to bring. I think the second feeling that I had was a little bit of panic. I remember as Jonah and I were getting ready to leave, we had just eaten a quick lunch. I had taken a shower, and, we're getting ready to go. And I looked at him and I said, "Do you hear the silence in here?" Because I have a feeling this might be the last time that it's just me and you. And just kind of like soaking in that moment of grieving, but also really excited to step into what the Lord had called us to, and just the consistent feeling of foster care, the both and, good and hard and all the things in between. And when we picked him up and when we got home that night, I think we were overwhelmed with all the feelings.
Yes, understandably. What about you, Jonah?
I think there's probably a degree to which I knew that what we were doing was new and unknown, but I probably didn't realize the extent to which that was the case. I remember, like I mentioned, I was doing a few things at work, and I was walking out to get in the car and come home to go leave. And a coworker of mine was walking in at the same time, and she said, "Oh, where are you going?" And I said, "Well, going to pick up a baby." And she was just totally shocked. And I didn't really react much. It was just kind of matter of fact. Yeah, we're going to pick up a baby. We've been waiting for a call, and this is what we're doing. And of course, her, having a few kids and knowing what it's like to take care of a baby, she was totally shocked, and she texted us later and ended up bringing some things over later that night. But I think the full significance of it was lost on me a little bit in that moment.
Sure. You didn't know what you didn't know quite yet.
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So let's talk about, he comes. Well, actually, we got to talk about when you first met him, when you first saw him, when you first held him. And were you able to meet his birth parents?
Yeah. So on the day that we picked him up, that was just, 48 hours shy of COVID really stepping in.
Oh boy.
And so we had gone into the hospital, and they asked us actually for the sake of the privacy of the parents to wait in the lobby. And we respected that. We waited down there. And it was actually pretty swift and in some ways looking back, kind of amazing that it happened this way. In essence, the social workers handled all of the discharge process. And so when they came down off of the elevator, they handed us a car seat and they said, "We will see you later. Go ahead and get him out to the car." And so there was really no time to look at them and they said, "Oh, by the way, here's the piece of paper that said the last time that they changed his diaper, what his name is, and when his next doctor's appointment is." So those moments, it wasn't like a ton of connection, but we got in the car and I think we were just in awe. I mean, we were not parents prior to that. And so in many ways, just a whole new experience of soaking him in. And when we got home, it's just an unbelievable few hours for sure.
Anything to add there, Jonah?
Yeah, it was terrifying. I mean, it was all pretty overwhelming. Before that, like we mentioned, we got supplies at the store, and then we came to the hospital. We're in this hospital parking garage and trying for the first time to install a car seat, something that we had never done before. And so we're out in the chilly day out in the parking garage and there's wind blowing and pieces of cardboard are flying everywhere and we're struggling to put this car seat in. So there's the logistics of things like that. And then just going in and picking him up, it was so brief, like Sarah said, and it all felt it felt less, maybe formal than I would have expected. She's not exaggerating when she says about those papers they gave. I think there was 2 papers and one said it was literally handwritten. His name was handwritten and some ID number. And then there was a sheet that had some general, when he last ate, when he was last changed, and more of just general medical type things. So it was crazy. After that, we went to a different store and picked up a few other things, and Sarah went inside and I went and sat next to him, and I thought he just stopped breathing and suffocated like 5 times. And in reality, he was just sleeping peacefully in the back seat. He had no problem at all, which that's due to my ignorance more than anything else. But it was overwhelming, scary, certainly.
Wow. So let's kind of walk a little bit quicker into, you can pick out, are there certain things that stood out in that first week, first year, first few months, of foster care that you want to highlight?
One thing that stands out to me was probably less than a week, maybe 5 days or so in, that we were sitting on our living room couch and we had heard earlier that day that the shelter hearing had happened or was going to happen. I don't remember the exact time frame of it, but we were learning a little bit more about not just what foster care was, but actually how it worked in the legal process and everything, which we really didn't know much about. And so we learned that there's this hearing that would determine whether or not he was going to stay in foster care even. And for whatever reason, we just had this feeling that something would happen and he would no longer be with us. And that was a moment of grieving. Sarah mentioned grieving in some ways earlier, in the sense of kind of grieving the stage of life we were in, of enjoying being just us. And it wasn't as if we didn't want this new season to come, but it was still the end of one stage and the beginning of another. And so we had that reality, but then even just a few short days later, it was a sense of we had begun to love him, and we certainly had in our vision the goal of foster care, and we weren't ignorant to that. But we also naturally had that connection with him, and so it was that first experience of kind of the uncertainty and kind of grief in action.
Yeah. And just for those who maybe are newer to foster care, when you talk about the goal of foster care, what do you mean by that?
The goal being to reunite children with their biological families. And so at that point, it wasn't as if we had some idea in our mind that we just wanted to take this child as our own. I mean, we would care for him in that way, certainly, but we recognized fully that he had a mom and a dad, a biological mom and a dad. And so we didn't want to minimize that, but it was also still tough to navigate what that would look like. Yeah.
It is an emotional roller coaster for sure. I remember that with our little ones. I remember Bobby, who did end up staying forever. Just this morning, I'm giving him a haircut, and crazy enough, he's now a teenager. But when he was a little baby, I just remember holding him and just having to surrender over and over, like, again, knowing, yes, I want his parents to succeed. I want him to return. And yet also feeling deeply, I want him to stay. It is it is just this crazy. And so just having to release over and over that, God, he is yours. And I think that really all of our children are the Lord's. And I think it was such a good time of remembering everything I have is his, right? But it's a unique experience in foster care.
Definitely.
Anything you want to highlight, Sarah, in some of those first weeks, months, year of foster parenting?
I think that the thing that really stands out to me is that reality that we can go through a training process, we can do our hours, we can have conversations with people that have done it before. And we can know in our mind a lot of information about being foster parents, about the goal of foster care. But then when it is actually transpiring within the walls of your home, it's totally different. And I don't really know that it can be communicated with words, what that's going to be like for you. And so I think there was a sense in which we felt unaware, not as if we had forgotten what we had learned, but just putting it into practice was very different, whether that be the connection that we felt with him, or whether that be even just the practical steps of the court process. Getting that message and saying that there was going to be a hearing for whatever reason came as a shock to us, which of course, I mean, that's a basic part of care. And so, I just think that we knew things, but we didn't realize what that would be like in practicality.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. As we talk about some of the things that only a foster parent can experience, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of hard things. There's a lot of emotions. There's a lot of funny things, things that are odd that you just don't happen when you have only biological kids. Do you remember any moments like that where you were like, okay, only because I'm a foster parent is this happening right now?
I can think of a couple instances, and they're all somewhat related. When people come up to you when you're holding a new baby and they say things like, "Oh, mama, you made such a beautiful baby." And I get to smile and say, I didn't make this baby, but thank you. And then they just look at you like a deer in the headlights, like, I don't understand. Or, wow, you look so awesome, assuming that I just gave birth to this child. Yes. Or, as you know, Jamie, we just had a biological daughter. And so when I was pregnant, so often people would ask, "Oh, is this your first?" And when I hesitated to respond to that question, I think people would look at me puzzled, like, this is a simple question. Is this your first? And that question does require an explanation, of course, in our circumstance.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Jonah?
I think the bulk of those types of things were related to Sarah. For whatever reason, I mean, obviously I didn't get the pregnancy related questions, but even
no one told you looked awesome.
Yeah, it's strange.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah. I don't think I really had many of those questions or comments and things. Can you think of any, Sarah? Thank you.
Not necessarily ones that are funny, but maybe ones that were maybe more cringeworthy, but we don't need to include that in this.
Yeah. Well, we started making kind of an informal list of things not to say to foster parents. So I'm sure you have plenty of those. I'm sure a lot of people have plenty of those. We're not unique in that regard.
Some of them. I would love to hear some of them if you want to share them.
Maybe you'll get one of your own someday. This will be good practice for you. Why can't parents just get it together?
Yeah.
Most things express a lack of understanding really about our situation specifically and or foster care in general. A lot of people just don't know what it is. And I get it. Like I mentioned earlier, I was certainly in that boat at one point, but it doesn't make those types of comments any easier to receive. So creates kind of some tricky territory, I think, at times of navigating one, just how do I respond in general? Or maybe do I take the opportunity to try to use the awareness word to try to bring some awareness? Or is there a time to just kind of nod and move on? And I think there's both of those certainly that we had.
I totally agree with that. And I remember also times when it was like people would say, "Oh, are they all yours?" And in those moments too, and for our family, we had some children biologically, some children who did not look like us who were adopted, and some children who did not look like us who were in foster care. And so, it does. You're like, and especially when the kids are there listening, what's an appropriate response for their little ears, for you, for this person? Those can be challenging to know. And so maybe just for our listeners to hear, if you say something to a foster parent and they look a little like, understand that there's some probably interesting dynamics going on in their heart. Also understand that there is grace for comments made well-intentioned, but maybe we don't realize how they might come off to someone who is in that situation. And so also don't want anyone listening who has maybe said something that you're going, "Oh no, I've said that."
Yep.
There's no shame. We're learning. We're all learning together. I mean, how many times have I put my foot in my mouth?
Certainly. Yeah.
Too many times to mention. Right. And so I think this is about awareness and about helping people see and understand so that we can all just continue to love each other well.
Yeah.
I also remember, I feel like, Sarah, we've talked about this before. There are so many times in foster care, especially when time has gone on, and maybe in certain situations, parents aren't doing the things that we believe they need to do and that the court is telling them to do. And we're disappointed and sometimes we're frustrated and we're navigating some of these feelings of like, okay, at what point do we get permanency for this child, whether they go home or do they get adopted? Like there's so many different emotions. In those times too, those comments can be especially wounding, simply because we are wounded. We are struggling. And so it's hard as a foster parent to feel like, so now it's my job to also to educate. It's just hard. Like, I just think these things are very real to mention that there are times when foster parents, we care, we want to advocate, we want to educate, but we're also tired and sometimes grieving.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, definitely. And
go ahead.
I was just going to say, when we're trying to process those thoughts ourselves and figure out where we're at. And maybe even a simple question triggers thoughts and emotions in us that we wouldn't have expected.
Sure.
Yeah, it just, maybe one day they could ask that question and I would have responded.
Yes.
And maybe they just caught me at a time where I'm still trying to figure out the answer to that myself. So yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I am reminded especially of questions about the case and about specifics. And I think both of us can probably look back and recognize ways that if we could go back in time, we would respond differently. There's a sense in which I know, at least for me, there was moments where it almost felt good. It felt a bit cathartic to actually share with someone about what was happening. But then I look back and I realize, well, it's not the end of the world that I shared that by any means, but there's also a sense in which the facts about our son's life and the facts of his biological family, and even what we're just experiencing personally, that's not some sort of public domain information that everyone's entitled to. And we may share, and that's okay. But at the same time, we don't have to share those things. And there's, especially when we're thinking of other people, I think there's value to saying, well, we don't necessarily want to share that, or that's his story to tell. That's their story to tell. And it doesn't mean we have to be rude to people, but we can lovingly say that to them and just leave it there. And
another aspect of foster care that is very unique is visit days, where kids go, and sometimes it's a weekly, or maybe it's every 2 weeks, or maybe it's more often, will go and visit with their biological parents. Sometimes the agency delivers the children, picks them up from your house and takes them. Sometimes foster parents actually do the transport. I want to hear your experience. Take it away.
Yeah. Jonah, do you want to talk about how they changed over the course of the duration of the case?
Sure. We had a variety of different logistics. Initially, as Sarah mentioned earlier, the very beginning of our case was just before the start of the COVID pandemic. And so the first visits for probably 3 months at least were done virtually through Skype, and we facilitated the Skype calls. Wow. As we mentioned earlier as well, we're talking about a newborn baby. So obviously it's not a child who is going to interact on a screen or really interact at all. And so that was a strange thing, but that was our first time that we met his biological parents. And so we were doing it through the screen. It wouldn't last long. Eventually, when things changed and things began to open up a little bit, we were able to then transport 2 visits, which first started as a third-party supervised visits. So we would go and we would meet at a neutral spot, typically a parking lot of some kind. At that point, the visits were happening with a couple of his biological half-siblings as well. And so it would be like a little caravan that would all convene at this parking lot. And then there was designated drivers that would then transport all of the children to where they were going to be doing the visit. So that happened for, what would you say, Sarah, maybe a year? Maybe not quite that long?
Yeah, maybe just under a year.
And then after that, things transitioned to agency supervised visits. And so at that point we drove as well, but we just drove to the agency and then dropped him off and then picked him up when it was finished. Throughout all of those, we had plenty of opportunities both before and after the visits to interact with bio parents. And so I wouldn't say we ever got to know them really, really well necessarily, but I would say we had lots of interaction. It was very regular that we were interacting and talking about things that were going on and stuff like that. But I'll let Sarah tell a little bit about what that looked like in terms of communication for us.
Yeah, I think as anxiety inducing as visits can be for everyone involved, I'll let Jonah, if he wants to kind of close out with that part, talk about those things. But in hindsight, I'm really grateful for the progression of visits that we had because it provided really good opportunities for conversation and for a better understanding of the situation all the way around. So in those early days, when things were happening on Skype, I think it was really helpful because we actually had the opportunity to have conversations with mom and dad throughout the duration of those calls. Because, for the first months of a baby's life, they're sleeping most of the day. And so we would try to coordinate for a time when he was going to be awake, but even those wake windows are so small. Yeah. And so a majority of those conversations were Jonah and I being able to interact with them and learn about them and get to know them a little better. And at the same time, them get to know us a little bit better. And the one thing that I really value and appreciate from those days is that I remember in preparing for those calls, I would feel so nervous about what he was wearing, where we were sitting, what things looked like, how I was caring for him during those calls, because I just wanted them to know that their child was in safe hands and that we were caring for him. And as we prepared to move those visits to them being monitored by other people's, I had a heart of deep empathy for them because I knew what it felt like to have someone watching me parent a child. And it was so stressful. And you don't feel like you can act like yourself because you're on edge. And so I think that prepared me with empathy for those next phases. It didn't make them necessarily easier to do those exchanges. I think that there was always nerves in having those, visit times, but I had a heart of empathy for them because you can't act like yourself when someone is watching and making notes. And obviously my scale is this big and theirs had great implications. Right. And so I just felt that. And then the second part of that, as we started to meet in person, I think that it's really easy as foster parents and as people who observe foster care, or maybe you don't even know a lot about it. I think it's really easy to dehumanize the biological parent in the situation. And I remember I would fall to that many times if we would go a month without a visit and I wasn't able to see them. But as soon as I was able to see them, it brought me back to earth. These are real people who are trying very hard, who love and care for their son. And I was so grateful that we were able to be a participant in that, because every single time it reminded me they do love him and they do care about him deeply and they are trying very hard. So no matter what happens here, I know that in my mind they are doing hard work. Yeah. So I really appreciated that. We had the opportunity then to engage with them and continue to get to know them. And we started a visit book. So we would write down things that had happened over the course of the past couple of weeks, keep them updated on what's going on at our house. And then in return, they would, write what had happened in the visit, what he had eaten, and just basic things. And so it started out as those little pieces of facts. But by the end, over 3 years of care and conversation with them, those conversations changed from, he ate 8 ounces at, 3:30 to, I'm really hopeful that I'm going to get this job, or I'm really grateful for the way that you cared for this, or I see these qualities. And so though, like Jonah said, I wouldn't ever say that we were, super, super close with them. I just feel like we had such a better picture into what was going on with them, and they had a better picture in our heart and our care for them. And so for that, I'm really grateful.
Wow, that's really beautiful. Jonah, were you going to add something regarding the anxiety of visits?
I can. Yeah, I think a recurring reality for me throughout foster care pretty early on was experiencing an anxiety that I just never really had before up to that point. And think it was true for both of us. I don't want to minimize that for Sarah, but I think it was probably more pronounced for me. And it was something that, especially on the times that we would be doing something like going to a visit or going to a court hearing, that would be especially pronounced. I don't think there was any easy solutions to that. I think it's part of simply being a foster parent and living amidst the tension of feeling, like what Sarah mentioned earlier, feeling the love and care for the child, but also wanting what is good for the parents and wanting to have a sense of restoration and wholeness and peace that God intends us to have in our relationships. And so again, I don't think there's any easy way around that. However, I will say that for me personally, and eventually both of us, but it started off for just me, I really benefited from beginning around that time to see a counselor and have the opportunity to talk through a lot of those tensions. And eventually then Sarah and I did some sessions together as well, which was really helpful. But that became a very helpful way to kind of ground myself in situations. And looking back, it was a real blessing. I think I would actually oftentimes go and drop off at an agency visit, and then I would go to my counseling session, and then I would come back later and pick him up. And so it was just that was really helpful. But I remember one of the sessions I was talking with my counselor, and he had recommended, he had asked me a question. I shouldn't say he recommended. He asked me, I wonder if there's a way that you could frame what you're doing when you are doing these things. Because I had just been talking about the intense and pronounced anxiety that I felt before visits and before court. And at that encouragement, I eventually began taking up the practice of just spending intentional time in prayer leading up to those times. I've found, both with regard to that and in general, the Book of Common Prayer to be a very beneficial way to pray and to kind of ground myself. And so I would use it. And if anyone isn't familiar, it's just a resource that was originally made by the Anglican Church that is a collection of liturgies and prayers, and then also much of it, in fact, the majority of it is scripture directly. And so it was a really powerful way for me to remind myself of truths of who God is, and to present my feelings and requests and anxieties before him. And again, I don't want to paint the picture like I do these things and it's some magic solution and everything was better and nothing was hard. But I certainly don't know. I wouldn't want to see what things were like if I wouldn't have done that. It was a real blessing for me.
That's incredible. And thank you for sharing that. I think I know that's been my personal experience as well. When we entered foster care, that was when I entered depression and had never experienced it before either. I remember going to the doctor and thinking, I just think, I think I'm tired, or I think my hormones are off a little bit, or probably just need a few vitamins. And the doctor saying, you're depressed. And I remember thinking, nope, I can't be depressed. What does that say about my relationship with God if I'm depressed? And I mean, that was faulty thinking. And God used that experience and has continued that depression, that anxiety, to draw me to him and to recognize my need. As people, we so often want to be self-sufficient. But the older I get and the closer I draw to the Lord, the more I recognize it's all about just being needy. Like, we get to be so needy and dependent on Christ. And the amazing thing is, he doesn't work it as a magic bullet. It's not like instantly we're just happy.
Yeah. But
he's near, and we feel his nearness, and we feel his hope and his purpose. And I just appreciate you sharing that, Jonah. I think a lot of people will resonate with that. I know for sake of time, I want to kind of finish off your story because not every foster care story ends in the way yours has, but many do. And so you had shared it was a 3-year journey, which is a long time in foster care. That does happen, and sometimes kids go home. What was your experience?
So a little over 2.5 years into the process, we were walking into a termination trial, which for context here in the state of Illinois is a 2-part hearing. So part of it being, are they going to terminate the rights? And if so, the second part would happen. And that's what is going to happen to the child at this point. And so, as you can imagine, we're walking into this hearing with lots of anticipation. And leading up to this point, just really wanting there to be permanency one way or the other for the sake of our son. It's a long time to live with someone else, especially during those early years and establishing relationship. And so I had a lot of feelings leading up, thinking I am going to feel so relieved when this is over because we're going to have a direction. I'm going to feel this weight that I have been piling on my shoulders for the past few years, and it's going to just be relieved after we get this done. And we went to that hearing, and ultimately they did decide to terminate the rights of his parents at that point. And when I walked out, I did not feel that weight lifted off of my shoulders at all. And I feel like that was such a reality check for me. I know Jonah felt very similarly as we sat in that courtroom. Your heart breaks in so many ways for those parents as they sat there and, people talked about them and the future of their life. And there was a real sense of privilege that I felt that I wasn't fully aware of until sitting through that conversation. And I'm just grateful that the Lord broke our heart in the way that he did. I know Jonah has mentioned before, we started out in foster care. We knew the goal of foster care. We desired that goal of foster care. And there are moments throughout where I think you waver back and forth. You have that tension of, I never want him to leave, but I don't want someone else's life to be turned upside down for the sake of that.
Right.
And I think that all comes to fruition in that moment of, this is not fun for anyone. This is really sad and really hard. And I don't want to say all of that and say that we never have felt that weight lifted off of our shoulders. The months went on. It was, maybe 6 months later that we were able to celebrate an adoption with him. And in that moment, there was a lot of joy and there was celebration and happiness, but it just wasn't what we were expecting.
It was never without the awareness of the realities of the brokenness. And I think if you're going, especially as a Christian, if you're going to engage foster care, I don't really think that should ever be separate. Because if you're not grieving over the fact that there is this brokenness, I think it either expresses kind of a hardness of heart or just a lack of awareness of the fact that there is a lot of brokenness inherent in foster care.
Yeah. I also remember that day. And expecting to feel just so happy, like, oh, we're going to now be able to adopt. And absolutely it was not, because we loved those parents and we had a relationship with those parents and we wanted better for them. And yet we had the mixed emotions of, and I am thankful that these kids are staying. Like it is just, and then you sometimes feel bad for feeling thankful. There's just all kinds of emotions in foster care. Man, Jonah and Sarah, I so appreciate you sharing. I do want to ask you one more question before we finish, because you are speaking to many foster parents right now, many foster parents, many people who just care about this community, some birth families, some kids that are growing up in foster care. I mean, we talk with, and some workers. We have people who listen from this community, and we care deeply about you, our listeners. What encouragement do you have as we close out for the foster parents specifically right now, the one who is really feeling weary in this journey?
Do you want to go first, or would you like me to go first?
I'll go first and be quick. I think at many points throughout our journey, I wanted it to be over. I was tired of feeling in limbo. I was tired of feeling the tension. It's hard to have those types of relationships for that length of a time. And I'm here to tell you that it will be over at some point, and you can make it to the end. And someday you'll look back with gratitude of the experience and the things that you learned, because without walking through those things, you won't experience the grace of God in the ways that you would have otherwise. And so through the long days, I just encourage them to remember it will be finished someday.
For me, something that was very helpful was probably about halfway through our time fostering, I came across this book. I know you've had Jen Hook on the podcast, and her book Replanted. I came across this and was reading it, and if other listeners know, they know it's provides a lot of good recommendations for the church and ways that we can engage foster and adoptive families as Christians. But then there's a part at the very end of the book that is a specific encouragement to foster parents. And I found it to be so helpful and encouraging. I scanned this, and I kept a copy of it in my backpack that I carry around with me as a reminder. And there she says 3 things. One of them is what Sarah alluded to, of doing your best to be grateful for what has happened, that we never quite know how a situation is going to turn out, but always be grateful and looking for ways that God may be working. And second is to seek hope with that, knowing that God is always present and working. And finally, I think the most impactful one was the last one. And that was an encouragement to view each moment that you have as a gift, even if you don't know what's going to happen. And that doesn't take away all of the uncertainty and difficulty, but it does provide you encouragement, I think. And I think for me, at least, it provided a sense of direction. So I didn't have to feel regret as much necessarily as I looked back and thought, oh man, I should have responded to that differently. She says in that section, the present can be a difficult time to enjoy because we feel both regret and guilt about the past, or anxiety about the future, or both. But the present moment is really all we have. The past can't be changed. We can learn from it, but we don't want to stay stuck there. And the future is unwritten. We don't know what will happen in the future, so it's a good idea not to worry about it too much. The present moment, though, is a gift. And it's easier said than done, no doubt, but it's a powerful reminder, I think, as well.
Amen to that. Well, I love you both very much, and
love you.
Appreciate you sharing your story with us today. Well, I hope that today's episode encouraged you wherever you are on your foster care journey. We want you to stay connected, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you will never miss an episode. Also, we have great content at theforgotteninitiative.org. Thank you for watching. I cannot wait to be with you next time.